She was not supposed to be there. That was the first thought that crossed her mind when the butler announced the evening's guest of honor, and every head in the ballroom turned. Not toward the doorway where Constance Ellaway stood in borrowed silk and a housekeeper's reference letter, but toward the woman on the Duke of Everleigh's arm. The woman who was not his wife. Constance had spent 4 months learning how to be invisible, how to carry a tea tray without rattling the cups, how to press linen without scorching it, how to answer, "Yes, ma'am," in a tone so flat and so practiced that no one looked at her twice. She had learned, in other words, everything her mother had never taught her, because her mother had always assumed that Constance would spend her life being looked at, not looking. Her mother had been wrong about a great many things. The ballroom of Everleigh House was everything Constance remembered, and nothing she had expected. She had been inside it once before, at the age of 17, when her father was still alive, and her name still meant something in this city. She had stood near the eastern window and watched the chandeliers throw their light across the floor, like something spilled, like something that could not be taken back. She had thought then that she would spend the rest of her life in rooms like this one. That was before the will was read, before she understood what it meant that her father had left everything, the house, the accounts, the entirety of Ashwell Park and its entailed lands, to a cousin she had met twice, a man named Fordyce Ashwell, who wore his inheritance the way certain men wear a new coat, stiffly, self-consciously, aware that it did not quite fit but unwilling to admit it, before she understood that everything meant everything, and that the small annuity her father had set aside for her had been tied, through a clause she had not known to look for, to her residence at Ashwell Park itself, which was now Fordyce's house, which meant that Fordyce could revoke it, which he did 6 months after her father's funeral, in a letter written in the third person and signed by his solicitor. She had stood in the kitchen of the lodging house where she'd been staying and read that letter 3 times. Then she had folded it, placed it in the tin box she kept under her bed, and gone to find a position. It had taken her 2 weeks to get the reference, another 3 weeks to find the opening. Everleigh House was not the first great house she had applied to, and it was not the grandest, but it was the one that mattered, because Everleigh House was where Fordyce Ashwell had been spending his Thursday evenings for the past 8 months, and Constance had spent those 8 months learning exactly why. The Duke of Everleigh was a man who collected things, paintings, horses, debts owed to him by men who could not repay them in money, and so repaid them in favors. Constance had pieced this together from conversation overheard in the servants' hall, from letters she had no business reading but read anyway, from the particular way the upstairs maids lowered their voices whenever the name Ashwell was mentioned. Fordyce owed the Duke a sum so large it had taken Constance 3 separate calculations to believe it, and the Duke, it seemed, had decided to collect, not in money, in land. Ashwell Park, her father's house, the house she had grown up in, where the library smelled of tobacco and old leather, and where the garden in June produced more roses than any garden had a right to produce, the house that was rightfully hers, in every sense that the law had decided not to recognize. She had come to Everleigh House to find the document, the agreement Fordyce had signed, the one she had heard mentioned in a letter she had slipped from an unsealed envelope and replaced before anyone noticed it was gone. The agreement that, if her reading of it was correct, contained terms that Fordyce had not understood when he signed them and would not survive if made public. She had not come to attend a ball, and yet the Duke of Everleigh, Edmund Rowe, the 7th Duke, a man she had seen only in portraiture until 4 months ago, stood at the center of the room with his hand at the small of a woman's back, and the woman was not his wife, and the room knew it, and no one said a word. His wife stood near the orchestra. Constance had not known, until that moment, what the Duchess of Everley looked like. She had formed a vague impression from the servants' hall. Quiet, the maid said, keeps to herself, not unkind. But she had not had occasion to see her, because the Duchess did not often come downstairs when the household was occupied with entertaining, and Constance had been careful not to be present when she did. She was younger than Constance had imagined. Perhaps 30, perhaps younger than that. She had dark hair dressed simply in a gown that was well made but not showy, and she stood with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is a form of armor. She was watching her husband, not with anger, not with the particular bright-eyed expression that Constance had come to associate with women performing the emotion of betrayal for an audience. She was watching him the way you watch something you have been watching for a long time, the way you watch a door you have already decided you are going to walk through. Patient, certain, done. The Duke leaned toward the woman on his arm and said something, and the woman laughed, and the sound carried across the ballroom in the way that certain sounds do when a room goes quiet enough to let them. The Duchess turned her head, very slightly, toward the orchestra. A man near Constance, she did not know his name, one of the guests, not someone she was supposed to be attending to, leaned toward his companion and said, in a voice he clearly believed to be low, "Good God! Has he no sense at all?" His companion pressed her lips together and said nothing. Constance pressed her lips together and said nothing, because she was a housekeeper's assistant, and housekeepers' assistants did not have opinions about their employers, and also because she had come here tonight to retrieve a document, not to watch a marriage dissolve in a ballroom in front of 60 witnesses. She moved along the edge of the room. That was the other thing she had learned in 4 months, how to move through a space without being seen, how to be part of the furniture. She had a reason to be here. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Trent, had asked her to oversee the additional serving staff brought in for the evening, which gave her legitimate access to the ground floor and, if she was careful, to the corridor outside the Duke's study. The document was in the study. She was almost certain of it. She was halfway to the door when the Duke raised his voice. Not much, not enough to shout, just enough to be heard. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe most of you have had the opportunity to meet Miss Thornfield this evening." The woman on his arm smiled. She had the smile of someone who had practiced it, who knew exactly how it landed, who had decided some time ago that this was a smile worth perfecting. "I wanted to take this occasion," the Duke continued, and his voice was smooth and certain and unbothered, the voice of a man who had never once in his life been made to feel that he had done something wrong, "to acknowledge Miss Thornfield's place in my life. She is not, as some of you may have assumed, merely a guest. She is, and I say this without reservation, the woman who holds my heart." Someone near the window made a small, strangled sound. The Duchess did not move. Constance stopped walking. The Duke was still speaking. Something about how society's conventions were, in his view, an artifact of an earlier age, and how he had great respect for the institution of marriage but believed that the heart could not always be made to conform to institutions, and how he hoped that his friends, and here he looked around the room with the confidence of a man who had not yet understood what he was doing, would join him in welcoming Miss Thornfield as a permanent fixture in his life and in his home. It was, Constance thought, possibly the most comprehensively foolish thing she had ever heard a man say in public. The room was very quiet. Then the Duchess of Everley moved. She moved the way she had been standing, without hurry, without drama, without any indication that she found the moment remarkable. She crossed the ballroom floor in a straight line, her gown making a soft sound against the parquet, and she stopped in front of her husband and the woman on his arm, and she curtsied, not to her husband, to Miss Thornfield. It was a perfect curtsy. The kind of curtsy you gave to someone of higher rank, performed with absolute correctness and absolute calm. And what it said without words, what it said in a language every person in that room had been raised to understand, was, "If you intend to take my place, then I will treat you as though you have already taken it. I will not fight you for it. I will not demean myself by fighting you for it." Miss Thornfield's smile flickered. "Your Grace," the Duchess said. She was speaking to her husband. Her voice was perfectly level. "I hope you and your guest enjoy the remainder of the evening." Then she walked to the door and she left. The room did not recover. Constance watched it try. The orchestra started up again, and people began talking at once. And two of the older women near the fireplace put their heads together with an expression that suggested consequences. But the room did not recover, because what had just happened in it was not the kind of thing rooms recovered from. The Duke stood very still for a moment. Then he said something to Miss Thornfield, and she touched his arm, and he looked down at her hand, and something moved across his face that Constance could not quite read from across the room. She didn't wait to read it. She went to the study. The document was where she had expected it to be, in the lower left drawer of the Duke's writing desk, in a folder marked with a date from the previous spring. She did not take it. She was not, despite everything, a thief. She read it, standing at the desk with the lamp turned low, and she read it again, and then she drew a single sheet of paper from the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket and wrote down 3 things: the clause number, the date, and the name of the solicitor who had witnessed it. Then she replaced the document, turned the lamp back to its original position, and left the study. She was back in the servants' corridor in under 7 minutes. She did not see the Duchess again that night, but she heard from one of the upstairs maids who had been stationed near the main staircase that the Duchess had gone upstairs, had called for her personal maid, and had spent the remainder of the evening in her sitting room, that she had sent no message to her husband, that she had eaten nothing, that when the household finally quieted around midnight, she had asked for a glass of water and then dismissed everyone and gone to bed. "Does she know?" the maid asked someone in the corridor outside the linen room. "I mean, does she really know? Or does she think?" "She knows," said the other voice. "She's known for a year, maybe longer." Constance lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters that night and thought about the Duchess's curtsy. The way it had been aimed at Miss Thornfield, not at the Duke. The way it had been performed with such precision that it couldn't be read as weakness, couldn't be turned into something small, couldn't be made into a joke. She thought about what it cost to do that in a room full of 60 people. She thought about her father's house, and the library, and the roses in June. She fell asleep still thinking about it. 3 weeks later, Constance gave her notice. Mrs. Trent accepted it without comment, which was Mrs. Trent's way of indicating that she neither expected nor required an explanation. She was a woman who had managed large households for 30 years and had learned that people left for reasons, and that the reasons were rarely the ones they gave. Constance gave the reason that she had a position elsewhere. This was true. She had, with the help of the 3 things she had written in her notebook, arranged a meeting with a solicitor of her own, a man named Mr. Cavendish, who had been her father's solicitor before Fordyce had replaced him with someone more amenable, and a Mr. Cavendish had read the clause and the date and the name and had been quiet for a very long time. "Where did you obtain this information?" he had asked. "From the document itself," Constance had said. He had looked at her over his glasses. "You read it?" "I have been in the house for 4 months," she said. "I had access." Another silence. "Miss Ellaway," he said finally, using her real name, the name she had not used since she walked through the service entrance of Everley House carrying a borrowed reference and a change of clothes. "If this clause means what I believe it means, then the agreement Fordyce signed is not legally enforceable." The land cannot be transferred. Ashwell Park cannot be transferred, Constance said. Yes, that is what I believed. It will not be a simple matter, he said. Fordyce will contest it. The Duke may contest it. There will be a period of— I understand, she said. I have time. She had. It turned out a great deal of time. The matter took 11 months. During those 11 months, she lived in 2 different lodging houses, worked 3 different positions. One of them, briefly, as a reader companion to an elderly woman in Hampshire who turned out to be a distant connection of her mother's, and who left her a small sum when she died, which was both unexpected and, in practical terms, enormously useful, and appeared when required at a series of meetings with solicitors and their clerks, and on one occasion a barrister who had a way of explaining legal concepts by drawing small diagrams on the back of whatever paper happened to be nearest to him. She did not think about the Duke of Everley. She thought about the Duchess occasionally, not constantly, but when she found herself in a room full of people who were performing their happiness for one another, she thought about the curtsy and what it had said and who had been in the room to hear it. The word had spread, as word always did. She heard it in the servants' halls of the houses she worked in, heard it at the lodging-house tables, heard it once from the elderly woman in Hampshire, who had read it in a letter from her niece in London. The Duke of Everley had made rather a fool of himself at his own house, and his wife had done something remarkable, and nobody had quite forgotten it. She curtsied to the woman, the elderly woman said, over her breakfast, reading aloud from the letter in a tone of considerable satisfaction. Curtsied, as though she were the superior party, which I suppose she was. Constance had said nothing and poured the tea, and thought about the Duchess's expression in that moment, which she had seen from across the room, at an angle, through 60 people's worth of candlelight and silence, and which had been, as best she could tell, the expression of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and was only now carrying it out. She got Ashwell Park back on a Tuesday in March. Mr. Cavendish sent a note the evening before saying that the matter had been resolved in her favor and that Fordyce had declined to pursue further litigation, possibly because his solicitor had explained to him what further litigation would cost and what it was unlikely to gain. She received the note at the lodging house, read it twice, and then sat down at the small table by the window and looked out at the street for a while. She had been 24 when her father died. She was 26 now. She would go back to Ashwell Park. She would open the library and let the air in, because the house had been closed for most of the past 2 years, and closed houses gathered a particular kind of staleness that she had never liked. She would see what state the garden was in. She would, in time, think about what came next. She folded the note and placed it in the tin box she still kept under her bed. In the morning, she packed her things. They fit, still, in the same 2 bags she had brought to London 2 years ago, which struck her as either economical or instructive. She wasn't sure which. She was in the hallway, bags at her feet, waiting for the cab she had ordered, when the woman at the front desk called her name. "Letter for you, Miss Ellaway." She did not recognize the handwriting on the envelope. She opened it there in the hallway, bags at her feet, and read it. It was from the Duchess of Everley. Or rather, from the woman who had been the Duchess of Everley, and was now, as the letter explained in brief and precise terms, pursuing a formal separation, which in the current legal climate was the closest available approximation of what she actually wanted. The letter was short. It said that the writer had heard, through channels she did not specify, that Constance Ellaway had recently been in service at Everley House. It said that the writer had also heard, through the same unspecified channels, that Constance had been service under a name that was not her own, and for reasons that were not those she had given to Mrs. Trent. The letter did not ask for an explanation. It said, simply, that the writer found herself in need of a solicitor recommendation, as she had recently discovered that the solicitors she had previously employed had been, in certain material respects, working at cross purposes to her interests. It said that if Constance was in a position to recommend someone trustworthy, the writer would be grateful. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting than the rest, I saw what you did in the study. I have said nothing, and I will say nothing, but I thought you should know. Constance stood in the hallway of the lodging house for a moment. Then she sat down on her bag and wrote a response on the back of the envelope itself. Because she did not have paper and the cab was coming, and she was not, she had decided, going to let this wait. She wrote, "Mr. Cavendish. His address is enclosed. He is honest. I will tell him to expect your inquiry," she added after a moment. The curtsy was the right thing to do. I am not certain you needed to hear that from me, but I thought you should know. She addressed the envelope and handed it to the woman at the front desk and asked her to send it. Then the cab arrived, and she picked up her bags, and she went home. The house was worse than she had expected. 2 years of intermittent occupation by Fordyce and his household had left the library in a state that she would not have been able to describe without losing her composure. So she did not try to describe it. She opened the windows. She made a list. She hired, over the following 3 weeks, a housekeeper, a cook, a gardener, and 2 maids, all of them local, all of them with the particular quality she had come to value above all other qualities in people who worked in close quarters with her. They did not ask more questions than the situation required. The garden was not as bad as the library. The roses had survived, somewhat to her surprise. The gardener, a man named Thomas, who had worked the grounds for a neighboring estate and had opinions about soil that Constance found both extensive and, against her expectations, interesting, said that old varieties often did, that they had been bred for endurance before they were bred for beauty, and that in this, as in other things, the older wisdom had something to recommend it. She thought about that. She heard from the Howitts, from Catherine, as she was coming to think of her, because Catherine had signed her second letter with her given name, and Constance had followed suit, twice in the spring and once in early summer. The letters were not long. They were, in tone, the letters of someone who had grown unaccustomed to being spoken to plainly, and was relearning it with some care. They said, in their way, that the separation was proceeding, that the legal situation was complicated but manageable, that London was loud, and that she was considering whether she wished to remain in it. In June, Constance wrote back and described the roses. In July, Catherine wrote back and said she had not seen a garden in 2 years, and that she was beginning to suspect this was not good for her. Constance wrote back and said that it was possible to see the garden, if she wanted to. Catherine came in August. She arrived on a Wednesday with a single traveling bag and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to arriving places with considerably more luggage and was finding the simplicity of the current arrangement either liberating or uncomfortable. She had not yet decided which. She was shorter than Constance had realized, seeing her across a ballroom, and younger looking, in natural light, without the particular armor of formal dress. They sat in the garden until the evening came. They talked about practical things, mostly. Catherine's legal situation, Constance's plans for the estate, the difficulties of managing correspondence with solicitors who seemed constitutionally incapable of writing a sentence under 40 words. They talked about the house in Hampshire where Constance had worked, and about the elderly woman who had left her money, and about what it was like to be in service in a house you'd once been a guest in, which Constance described with more frankness than she'd expected to, and which Catherine received with more equanimity than Constance had expected her to. "I knew you weren't a housekeeper's assistant," Catherine said at some point in the evening when the light was going amber and long across the grass. Not within the first week. What gave me away? You read the labels on the wine. Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I should have been more careful. Probably, Catherine said. But it didn't matter. Mrs. Trent suspected, I think. She said nothing. Why? Catherine considered. Because you were good at the work, she said. And because, I think, she had a sense that you were there for a reason that was not malicious. Mrs. Trent is a very good judge of that sort of thing. The light went on going amber. In the garden, the roses were still blooming. Later than usual, Thomas had said, because of the cool spring, but none the worse for it. He came to find me, Catherine said after a while. 2 weeks after the ball. He came to the house, the dower house, where I had moved. He stood in the entrance hall and said that he had not intended it to go as it did, that he had thought. And here he was very careful about his phrasing, that he had thought people would understand. What did you say? Nothing. She was quiet for a moment. I looked at him for a while. And then I told him that I was aware he had not intended it to go as it did, that very few things go as people intend them, and that I hoped he would find, in time, the happiness he was looking for, and then I asked him to leave. She paused. He looked as though he expected something else. I don't know what. Perhaps he thought I would cry. I had cried, certainly, in private, a great deal. A low day, but by the time he came to find me, I had finished with it. Constance thought about this, about what it meant to finish with something, about the tin box under her bed and the solicitor's letter and the clause she had written down by lamplight in a house that was not hers. Do you regret it? She asked. Coming here. Starting this? Catherine glanced at her. The separation. The letters. Coming here. Catherine looked at the roses for a moment. No, she said. I spent 8 years being quiet in rooms. I am tired of being quiet, she paused. I am not angry anymore, I think. Or not only angry. I am something else. I am not sure I have the word for it yet. Free, Constance said. Catherine turned to look at her. Perhaps, she said. Yes. Perhaps that is the word. The evening came on, and the garden went dark by degrees, and the roses closed the way roses do, not all at once, but gently, without drama, as though they had simply decided that the day had given them everything it had to give, and that was enough. Constance did not look back at the house that night. She had stopped needing to. It was hers, and it was standing, and the library would take the rest of the summer to put right, and Thomas had opinions about the south wall that she was beginning to suspect were correct. She was 26 years old. She had her father's house back. She had, outside in the garden, someone who understood, not because they had lived the same life, but because they had both learned, in their different ways, the same thing, that the quietest exits are sometimes the most permanent, that what you take with you when you walk out of a room is not what the room remembers, that the room remembers what you left behind.